Here we are. Thanks for coming. So, my name is Colin Grant, and I write some books. I've written some books. I suppose relative to this conversation, one of the two things that I've done in my most recent years, I used to work for the BBC, or the Bumberclark Broadcasting Corporation, as my friends tell me. And currently I'm the director of an organisation called it's called WritersMosaic, which is a division of the Royal Literary Fund, which has been in existence since 1790. It started off to help writers get out of debtor's jail, because, spoiler, apart from Sathnam and a few others, people don't make any money from writing. And it's been going since then. So, in a way, we'll be feeding some of those thoughts about the longevity of these institutions into our discussion today. But welcome to the Southbank. Well done for coming out and realizing that there's more to life than football and tennis. Although we'll be rushing back afterwards, won't we, Sathnam, to see how we fare tonight. I'd like to begin by thanking Claire Hill, who joins us for the live speech and text transcription. This event is part of a summer season called You Belong Here, which is inspired by the unsung stories and forgotten trailblazers celebrated in our Hayward Gallery. I don't know why I say our. Well, I suppose it is our, in a way.
For an hour.
For now. We own these institutions, you could say, in a way. It's an exhibition by Tavares Strachan called There Is Light Somewhere. And I think that's a title that perfectly conjures what Sathnam Sanghera has done with his latest book, which both illuminates the darkness of British and world history and offers hope. Sathnam Sanghera was born to Punjabi parents in the West Midlands in 1976. He started school unable to speak English, but went on to graduate from Christ's College, Cambridge, with a first-class degree in English language and literature. His first book, The Boy With The Topknot, a memoir of love, secrets, and lies in Wolverhampton, great title, by the way.
It wasn't mine, someone else.
Was followed by the novel Marriage Material, also a good title.
Not mine either.
Not yours.
No.
His third book, Empireland, How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain, was named a Book of the Year at the 2022 British Book Awards. That was your title?
No, again, Penguin's idea. Yeah. I'm not very good at titles.
But that book has inspired the sequel, which we'll focus on today, Empireworld, How British Imperialism Has Shaped the Globe. Incidentally, that book will be on sale by the Foyles team in the foyer after this presentation. Before becoming a writer, Sathnam's jobs included working at a burger chain, unnamed burger chain.
Burger King.
Burger King.
I should just say Burger King, shouldn't I?
A hospital laundry, a market research firm, and a sewing factory. As a journalist, he's worked at the Financial Times and the Times, and he's cut his teeth at least once on a TV program called Have I Got News For You, which I think you enjoyed, didn't you?
Yeah, it feels pathetic that I've only done it once.
After today, they'll be inviting you back, I'm sure. The author, Jonathan Coe, who's a great writer, I admire him, has said of Sathnam that whether writing autobiography or fiction, he always does so with incredible grace, generosity, and humour. Sathnam Sanghera.
Thanks. I hate listening. You don't know where to look when someone's reading out your CV, do you?
Yeah.
I wish I'd brought your CV along so I could reciprocate it and make you feel awkward.
Well, thank God you didn't. But we're going to speak for about an hour, and then some of you have sent in some questions which we vetted, and I'll be reading out some of those questions.
To be honest, we can't see you because the lights are so bright. So
if you smile, we can see your teeth.
I assume there's people out there who have sent questions.
Yes, they have, at least half a dozen. Right, Sathnam, relative to the title of the Hayward Gallery show, You Belong Here. You Belong Here. Does that resonate with you, that title, You Belong Here? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most common questions I get about these books is, has studying the history of British Empire made you hate Britain? Or has it made you hate white people? And I feel exactly the opposite. It's made me feel like I belong in Britain even more profoundly than I understood before, because before I just thought I bought the media narrative, which is that brown and black people arrived in Britain because of Windrush, and after that, basically to take advantage of the British and abuse them. That's the media narrative, right? But actually, people of colour have been coming to Britain for centuries.
Yeah, sure.
And as a Sikh, the Sikhs took the side of the British. At the 1857 mutiny, have been fighting for the British for centuries, and there are profound reasons for why you and I are here.
Absolutely. So when I was about 10, I used to have this rather neat description for when people asked me where I was from. I would say, I was British by birth, but Jamaican by will and inclination. And if ever my father, who was called Bageye because he had really baggy eyes, if ever Bageye heard me, he'd say, "Stop talk tripe, you're born right here. You are English, I am British." Now let's get that straight. Did you have any kind of construction of words to describe what you were when you were asked that question growing up?
I think it's changed. I think a lot of people of my generation, yours, have changed the way we talk about ourselves during our life. So I used to say British Asian. I used to use the phrase second-generation immigrant, which I think is a toxic phrase, because I don't think the word immigrant belongs in our life story, because our parents we were literally born here. So I don't use that phrase anymore. But to be honest, I'd say I'm from Wolverhampton quite often. That's enough to confuse people, because no one knows where Wolverhampton is, seemingly.
Yeah. Close to Birmingham.
Yeah.
Ish.
That's such an insult, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll try not to insult you too much.
It's just off the M6.
Yeah.
Just say that.
But when you were growing up, when you were younger, what idea, if any, of the British Empire did you have as a boy?
Almost none, to be honest. But looking back, I did actually have some education in the British Empire, because I did GCSE history, and we specialised on Ireland. So I learned a lot about Irish history, the potato famine, the Troubles. But during those 6 months of education about Ireland, no one once mentioned the phrase British Empire. So I never made the connection between... There's actually thousands of connections between the Irish and the Sikhs. Even in Wolverhampton, when the Sikhs arrived, we were accused of creating slums, of not integrating, of not speaking the language. Exactly the same accusations were made about the Irish, who were living in the same streets 100 years before us. They practiced a weird religion, they spoke Gaelic, they were drunk all the time. Literally, that's what Enoch Powell was alleging about the Sikhs. But again, no one made that connection. I think a lot of this is not just ignorance, it's the lack of connections that are made. So it also applies to the World War history. No one mentioned during all those Remembrance Day services that we had that we were there too, that our ancestors fought in millions.
And did you have an allegiance with the Irish people when you were growing up?
No. Didn't know any, to be honest.
You didn't know any?
Weirdly, although it was a very racially diverse school, it was racially diverse in that I had a lot of black people and Sikhs. But I didn't meet a Jewish person until I was about 23. Didn't know any Muslims. I think in the census of 2012, found that there's something like 12 Jewish people in Wolverhampton. It's a really odd place, so it's very intensely Sikh and very intensely Jamaican.
Why would you go to Wolverhampton?
Why would you go to Wolverhampton?
No, I mean, why would someone...
Apart from the football club.
No, but why would you, if you were a migrant, why would you end up in Wolverhampton, do you think?
Oh, for the jobs.
Yeah, what kind of jobs were there?
Well, it's really... The name Black Country derives from the fact a lot of hard industry there, so iron foundries and metalwork. So all of my uncles who came, like a lot of Sikhs, did really hardcore manual labour. My grandfather was working, doing heavy manual labour till he was 76.
Wow.
And he was working illegally. But a lot of people did that in that day.
But I'm always curious about why people end up where they do. So I read a book about migration to Britain from the Caribbean. And if you're from St. Vincent, you end up in High Wycombe. If you're from Trinidad, Barbados, you end up in Reading. If you're from Nevis and St. Kitts, Leeds, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And I did ask some people who were from St. Kitts originally why they ended up in Leeds when I was writing my book about them. And they said that there was only one train when they were growing up that ran for the whole island. And when that train broke down, engineers would come out from Leeds to fix it.
All
So
right.
in their mind, Leeds was Britain. So when
All
they had
right.
the chance to leave St. Kitts, they went to Britain, i.e. Leeds.
All right, wow. And I think this story, if I'm right, with Windrush, is a lot of the people on the actual Windrush ended up in Clapham. They were housed there, right, temporarily?
Yeah.
And that's how Brixton became a famously
Yeah.
black area.
Yeah.
Is that random?
Absolutely. You put down roots where you land, I suppose.
And there's a lot of Sikhs in Heathrow. Guess
Right,
what?
Of course, yes.
You know,
yeah.
they, they
There's
put
a lot of Scottish people in and around King's Cross.
all right, of course,
Yeah,
of their railways.
Absolutely. So when you think about your parents and your grandparents' relationship with Britain or with the idea of the British Empire, what would you say that was? What was their relationship?
To be honest, they didn't talk about it. They were all illiterate. My dad was is illiterate, and there wasn't a single book in our household. We didn't have conversations about that kind of stuff. If anyone raised racist abuse that we were having, I think like a lot of our parents of that generation, they would be like, oh, just suck it up and don't make a scene and just try to fit in. It wasn't about taking it on or trying to intellectualize it, wasn't it?
But in your book, I think you say, correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been 6 months since I...
Yeah, my grandfather would go on about how amazing white people were. And not in the sense of being a white supremacist, but in the sense of, isn't it amazing everything they've done?
Yeah.
And actually, occasionally traveling around the world, I do have moments like that where you're like, oh my God, I'm in Barbados. They're growing sugarcane because the British made them grow sugarcane. And actually, my ancestors were growing sugarcane because the British said they should grow sugarcane. Opposite sides of the world. And isn't it like mind-blowing that the British, who just happened to be white people, did all of this?
Yeah, it shows great industry, I suppose.
Yeah, slight downside of the slave economy.
Yeah. So from 1950, there's a chap called Enoch Powell, who was the MP for Wolverhampton South West, and would have been so during your childhood and young adulthood, I imagine. Infamously, he wrote the Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, where he warned there was the danger that the black man would have the whip hand over the white man. So did Enoch Powell ever figure in discussions in your home with your family or friends or in your imagination?
Only indirectly, in that I remember when people would come and solicit for people's votes at home, my mum would say, well, we should vote Labour because they don't mind immigrants, whereas the Tories want to send everyone back.
Wow.
And that was the narrative. We used to have his successor come and talk to us at school, who was even more right-wing than Enoch Powell. Enoch Powell actually lived at the back of our school. And it's interesting how, he's probably one of the most important politicians in terms of his influence of the 20th century, but he's not commemorated in any way. And there's a battle to get a statue or a plaque put up. But obviously, he's got a toxic heritage there. But I think it's important to remember him, because otherwise you create a narrative that kind of racism wasn't mainstream, where it was really mainstream.
Absolutely.
He was hugely popular.
Yeah, when that speech was made, people think he was vilified, but they had to lay on special vans from the post office that had so many people writing letters of support.
Yeah, and there were
Over
marches all around the country, and the trade unions backed him. And now we see the trade unions as being intrinsically left-wing, but they really took his side.
Did you ever meet Enoch Powell?
No, I didn't know.
I followed him once.
Strange voice. Can you do the voice?
I can't do the voice. No, but I followed him because he used to wear this Homburg, didn't he?
Yeah.
And I remember where I saw him at Euston once, and I just I'm just going to follow him for a while. And I followed him for a little while, for about 4 or 5 minutes, and then he turned around, and his eyes were on fire. He was quite an intense man, I think.
Strange man, because he wanted to be Viceroy of India. And then when that didn't happen, he decided weirdly that the British Empire didn't exist. That was his position. It was like it never happened. A strange coping strategy for his career failure.
Man in denial, yeah. Now look, the new book, Empireworld, How British Imperialism Has Shaped the Globe, is a sequel to the previous book, How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain. So was it always going to be a two-book?
No.
What happened?
No, to be honest, I didn't really want to write another book because it was about empire, because it was amazing, but also toxic, being in the culture wars, quite a lot of abuse at events like this.
Were you surprised by that?
I've worked
No
out.
hecklers, by the way, no hecklers.
You know what? I think this audience are going to be okay because I've worked out what it is. It's about the price of the ticket. Yeah. If you do an event below £10, someone who hates you is willing to pay £10 to come and shout at you. But I've checked the ticket prices. You've paid more than that. So we're fine.
Okay, but seriously, so your publishers came to you and said, look, the first book's done well, you've made us a lot of money, how about another book?
No, it didn't work like that. I very much wanted to do something else. It's just that I would do events and people would ask me certain questions and I didn't have the answer for them. Questions like, didn't the British Empire introduce democracy to large parts of the world? Mm-hmm. Didn't the British Empire introduce the rule of law to the world? Mm-hmm. And all these questions that I didn't really have an answer to, and were global in nature, and I thought I should have answers for them. Also, I went to Barbados and...
Okay, we're going to get to Barbados shortly.
Had a bad time.
So the Guardian reviewer of your book wrote, modern writing about imperialism has prized the stopper from the genie's bottle, releasing malodorous truths. Empireworld makes it more difficult for revisionists whose hearts may swell when reciting Kipling's The English Flag to return the genie to that bottle. That was me.
That was you, yeah. I was going to say.
How did you feel about that?
I thought, that word, malodorous, how do you say that?
Malodorous. Yeah.
I thought I should use that more often. Yeah. And that's what I thought.
It's a bad smell, basically.
Yeah, no, it's a good word, isn't it?
So the English Flag includes the line, what do they know of England who only England know, or was they fed? I imagine you'd agree with that sentiment.
Yeah, there's a gap between the way we don't talk about empire, or our dysfunctional way of talking about it, and the way the world understands it. In general, the world has quite a good knowledge of the British Empire because they remember what happened when we turned up in boats and with guns and permanently changed their countries. And it's quite well taught in places like China and the Caribbean, India, even Nigeria, and yet we don't. So this makes us highly dysfunctional, especially when we're trying to go around the world at the moment, trying to get new Brexit deals. And we're turning up in Mauritius going, hey, guys, give us better economic conditions. And they're like, oh, should we talk about what you did to us and how you shaped us? Or especially the Caribbean. When you turn up there and you're like, and we do it routinely. I mean, David Cameron, turning up in Jamaica, and trying to set up a new economic deal for a new prison with no memory of how we punished the enslaved, how we created the conditions for their crime rates, and how actually Enoch Powell, go back to him, he was the minister who first poached health workers from the Caribbean. So that's misery upon misery. So we don't give these enslaved good healthcare, or any healthcare. When we leave, we don't give them money to set up a healthcare system. And then in the 20th century, we turn up and we steal their workers. And we do this with no awareness of what we've done before. And we do this in so many different ways around the world.
It's amazing how you can live with that kind of denial. You've written about the kind of commonplace abuse that you suffered when you wrote the first book. You said it was as commonplace as my morning bowl of porridge. So did you have any nervousness about writing the next book, having had that experience and that kind of vitriol directed at you? Yeah,
to be honest, it was on my mind all the time, which is why one of the reasons the bibliography is so long, because people are going to really come for you. And
in what form do they come for you? What happens?
I mean, some of it's just basic abuse on Twitter, some of it's shouting at events, but actually, with this book, a succession of shadowly funded right-wing websites were attacking the book before it even came out. Really long essays from right-wing historians explaining why I'm a twat, over 8,000 words, just one after another, before the book's even come out. And it's quite, mentally, it's quite a lot to deal with.
Yeah.
It's hard to not let that get to you.
So what was your approach to deal with?
I didn't read them. Problem is, people tag you. So well-meaning people like you guys, possibly, will be like, can you believe that this person has said this about you, Sathnam? And you've been trying not to notice it. But I've actually came off social media completely, so I had a social media manager. So it wouldn't affect me. But it was really intense because it can make you very self-conscious about writing a single word when you think that loads of people are out to get you.
Yeah, it's terrible because most writers live with the little devil of doubt on their shoulder anyway.
Yeah.
So you'd have thousands of little devils on your shoulder.
Yeah, all the time, yeah.
Were you surprised, though? I mean, I suppose what I'm interested to find out is why you think there is so much antipathy towards any kind of serious interrogation of the darker sides of British history. What's going on, do you think?
Well, I'm sure you've had this with your Windrush books and your memoirs, but there's, let's face it, something to do with my skin colour as well, because as William Dalrymple said, he's been writing stuff like this for decades and he hasn't had a single letter of abuse, and I've got hundreds sitting at home.
Why are they still there? Why don't you burn them?
Because occasionally I have to write about it. And I did have to refer to some of the abuse in the book, so it's good to have the evidence.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to tell the police. I mean, if people routinely are getting in touch with you, it turns to a stalking situation. And, I had one guy turning up at every single event. And he wasn't the guy, he was actually an Asian guy.
Oh, wow.
And he asked the same aggressive question. And he's like, mate, you don't want an answer. You want me to fucking agree with you. And I'm not going to agree with you. You can keep on asking, but the ticket prices are going to go up. So I hope you can afford it.
Has he stopped following you?
Actually, he might be here tonight, but today, sorry. It's dark, easily confused. Yeah. I forgot what the question was.
Well, I suppose it's, I was wondering what the psychology is that makes people nervous about interrogating their past or have their past interrogated for them.
Well, it goes back to Empire itself. Empire is so often an expression of British patriotism on the right. And a lot of people were taught that the nostalgia about British Empire was true. They learned it at school. They left school holding on to this as fact. It's part of their identity, their family might have served in the British Empire. And then a black person or a brown person turns up and says, David Olusoga or me or you, and we go, actually, it wasn't like that. It's more complicated. Well, actually, the British people were racist. Yes, we beat the evil racist Germans, but we were really racist. And actually, we helped create modern notions of racism. And you can see how that can really affect someone's sense of identity to the core. And why they would get so furious about it. But part of the problem is that people leave school thinking that history is facts when it's argument.
Sure.
And it's a failure of our education system on a very basic level.
Yeah, because historians don't write history, they curate history. Don't they?
Well, we had Rishi Sunak, R.I.P., saying in relation to slavery, he said in Parliament, we should not unpick our history. And it's
Really?
like,
Wow.
mate, that's literally what historians do. They unpick history about the Roman Empire. I did an event with Mary Beard this week. She unpicks the history. Her understanding of the Roman Empire has drastically changed in 30 years. Our history of understanding of empire is changing wildly. Like since Neil Ferguson's book 20 years ago, there's been a total sea change in what historians understand of what happened in empire. Of course our understanding will change, but there's certain people out there who think it should remain fixed. Actually, Nigel Farage's Reform Party, it's part of their manifesto that they want to use history as an extension of patriotism.
What the British are very good at is the propaganda of turning the story around on its head. So when I was growing up in Luton, the capital of Britain, we were taught that weren't the British great because William Wilberforce brought about the end of slavery?
Yeah.
The former part of that sentence was never really expressed.
Reminds me of that line. It's Eric Williams, the historian, said that the way the British talk about slavery is almost as if they only got into slavery so they could abolish it and be great. Let's forget about the 3 million Africans that were enslaved, killed, raped, and so on.
Yeah.
We abolished slavery.
Yeah.
Aren't we great?
Well, I suppose in life, I'm sure that you and I are the same, we want to feel good about ourselves, don't we? So you latch onto those things which you think are worthy, and you kind of quietly put under the carpet those things which you are a bit nervous about sharing.
It's mad. I mean, history is so complicated. I mean, one of the analogies, I think, is like saying, I want to understand the climate, but I'm only going to study the sunshine or the rain.
Yeah.
But it works both ways. Actually, doing that's not going to help you give you a good sense of the climate of the last 300 years. You have to study the weather in between. And fundamentally, the British Empire was highly contradictory.
Sure.
It involved slavery, but it also involved anti-slavery.
Yeah.
You know, and
Yeah, well, you bring that really well in your book. You begin the book by establishing some of the virtues of empire. So Richard Turnbull, do you know him? The governor of Tanganyika from 1958 to 61 once remarked that the empire would leave behind only two monuments. One was the game of association football, and the other was the expression "fuck off." Can you give us some ideas of your hit list?
That's a good day to mention that quote, isn't it? Yeah. Actually, yeah. I mean, like tonight's final, it's an imperial spectacle, basically. So the majority of the countries who ended up playing football is because they inherited football directly or indirectly from the British Empire, even Argentina and Uruguay. As you've probably seen the meme of what the English football team would look like without immigration. You could do that diagram again and say, what would the English team look like without imperial immigration? I think it'd be pretty similar, you know, in that it would look very, very different. And also the racism, which has been part of the English game, you know, as the supporters for most of my life, that comes straight from empire too. So there's so much about football that would not make sense or wouldn't happen if it wasn't for the British Empire. I don't know if you saw that meme or that video a week ago of the Indian and Pakistani cricket supporters.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so they broke, I'm sure you guys, most of you have seen it, but it was during a game between India and Pakistan. They obviously hate each other, but they all came together to watch England take the penalties. And they all supported England, thereby undermining Norman Tebbett's famous cricket test, right? Which is that you have to make a choice between India, Pakistan, and England. Actually, most of us managed to have multiple sources of patriotism and pride and whatever connection.
Yeah, someone from the Punjab or from Jamaica is more likely to support England than someone from Scotland.
Probably, yes. Yeah.
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 Now, I remember because I grew up in a place that's a lot of Irish people. All my friends are Flynns, O'Loughlin's, Dunns, O'Hearns, Glynn. And we would have this...
This is Luton?
Luton, yeah.
Very Scottish, is it?
Scottish and Irish.
Oh, right, okay.
And South Asian and Caribbean and a smattering of white English people.
I still don't want to go.
Okay. Well, we would have this kind of... I mean, you allude to it, and we're going to talk a little bit about this later. You allude to this sort of hierarchy of suffering. So we would have these arguments with our Irish friends, and we'd say, look, we've been under the heel of the English for 400 years of slavery. And they'd say, no, that's nothing. We've been under the heel of the English for 800 years and more. And a friend of mine who's half Irish and half Yoruba, and I put on a talk the other day, and we called it, Tired of Being Black, Try Being Irish. One of the things that I really wanted to explore, though, was what are those things that you feel proud about or pleased about that the English have done in your name, even before you were alive, that still have some sort of lasting, relatively useful consequence?
Yeah, I think pride and shame have no place in history. So I wouldn't say I'm proud or ashamed or anything, but I find certain things really interesting.
Such
like
as? Yeah.
Tea. I find tea is really interesting. The main reason, obviously, British people drink a lot of tea, although the Irish drink more tea than us, and the Russians do, apparently. It's because of empire. It's because the East India Company is making a fortune importing tea from China to Britain. But actually, the reason Indians drink tea is also because of the British. And Indians don't really understand this. In 1900, almost no one in India was drinking tea. If by 1980, almost everyone was drinking tea, it's because the British Empire decided they can make a fortune from selling tea to Indians. And actually, then you get these weird... People go crazy occasionally about the fact that Starbucks sells chai tea. I understand the phrase is annoying because it's like saying TT, right? It's annoying. But actually, all culture is appropriation. And chai, arguably, you could argue it's a British creation, although it's also an Indian creation in that what happened is that the British were trying to get Indians to drink tea. They didn't want to drink it in the British way. They started putting spices into it. The British were like, don't do that. It tastes terrible. And also, you're using less tea, so we're making less money. So you could argue that chai is a rebellion against British Empire. But it's quite convoluted and it's complicated. It's not what people think it is. It's not a straightforward thing where tea is Indian. Most of the tea growing in India now is a mixture of being Indian indigenous plants and Chinese indigenous plants. That's really interesting, I find. I'm interested by the nuance. I'm fascinated by ganja. Not that I smoke it.
You can admit it here. We're amongst friends.
But, intrinsically Jamaican product, but introduced by Indian indentured laborers.
Absolutely.
When you think about it, of course, ganja is an Indian word. It's a Hindi word.
Ganja, yeah.
Yeah, and introduced by the 1 million Indian indentured laborers sent around the world to replace the enslaved. And of course, you have goat curry, roti in Jamaica, all these things that come from Indian culture. And again, amazing how the British Empire did all this.
Do you know that Queen Victoria had heavy periods, and to help her with her menstruation, she was prescribed marijuana?
All right.
Yeah. And
it's probably a break from the cocaine that all the Victorians were taking every day.
Yeah. But the reason why marijuana was made illegal is because it wasn't practical. You couldn't make it. It couldn't be put in a syringe and made voluble and squeezed into your body. So it made those new developments in medicine redundant. So that's why it went. It didn't go because there's any kind of moral outrage about it. It's a kind of practical solution to bringing on some other medicines. One of the interesting things about Sathnam's book is the way you divide up the chapters in an unusual way. So there's a big chapter called The Useful Plants, which explores how plants forged empire. Focuses on Kew Gardens and the evolution from 1840 onwards as an incubator of economic botany, developing, for example, species of cinchona, which would be used more effectively to yield quinine. Why is that important?
Yeah, actually, this is one of those surprising things, because I think most of us know that gin and tonic is an imperial legacy, but actually it's not, I discovered in the book, because there's not enough quinine in your gin and tonic to help you with malaria. It would need to be 4 or 5 times stronger. So if you want it to have a medicinal effect, have 5, right? So cinchona is the bark of a tree, contains quinine, which doesn't cure you of malaria, but helps you survive it. And the British spent decades trying to build cinchona plantations, trying to perfect the technique of getting quinine. Eventually, they sort of did it alongside the Dutch. And you think, so what? It's just plants, right? But actually, it's because of this that Africa got colonized. Because before quinine, the average Englishman going to, say, Mali was facing a 400% chance of mortality, which meant they would probably survive for 3 months. So they couldn't colonize. As soon as they had quinine, they could colonize a whole swathe of the planet. So that's a plant that changed the course of the world. Tea changed the face of the world. Rubber. When we discovered rubber, and we set up rubber plantations in places like British Malaya around Singapore, that became Malaya. British Malaya became the most valuable colony for the British. They're making wild profits from these plantations, and it actually resulted in a war that we never talk about. In one of the darkest episodes of the Empire, they called it the 1948 Malayan emergency. And I love the fact about why it was called the emergency. Do you remember this? Why was it called an emergency rather than a war? For insurance reasons. Because if they called it a war, the insurers wouldn't have paid out. So they call it an emergency, but also that enables us to forget it ever happened. Because it doesn't sound like a war, does it?
No.
But actually, it involved awful, like Mau levels of extreme repression.
So, in a way, when you're walking around Kew Gardens, you're not really aware of that history, are you? People aren't really focusing on that.
No, it's usually loads of Sikh aunties, because they live in near Heathrow, who have come to see the flowers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, have you done a talk at Kew Gardens? You should.
I have, yeah.
Okay.
There's a growing desire amongst the staff there to talk about these colonial histories, but they've been caught up in the culture wars. So whenever they try to do work, they get lambasted by the Telegraph for being woke. And, it's only flowers. Why are you trying to bring in colonialism into flowers? And obviously, it also involved war and slavery and repression.
Can you understand what the Telegraph is doing there and why they're doing it there? I mean, this comes back to this idea of not wanting to have unpalatable truths illuminated, expressed. I wonder that because you start the book by actually listing in detailed way some of those things that people might find attractive about the legacy of Britain around the world. There's a Trafalgar Square in Barbados, Nelson's column in Barbados. There are double-decker buses, red double-decker buses in Jamaica. Were you doing it because you just generally were intrigued by that, or were you actually, in some way, placating the detractors who were going to come after you?
No, I think I generally, I'm not someone who reads a lot of history books, or haven't written that many. And I find history books quite foreboding in that they assume a lot of knowledge.
Right.
And they can be quite boring and unfunny. And so I try to bring people in. I was trying to make it accessible as a subject to people in terms of relating it to their daily lives. Because this history does explain a lot of our daily lives, the stuff we've talked about.
When I wrote my first history book, I had what I thought was a rather backhanded compliment in The Guardian, and the reviewer said the book was very readable. And,
that's the ultimate compliment, I'd say. I think one of the writers I most admire is, and no one ever mentions him like in a serious way, is Bill Bryson. Because he had such a talent.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he became more and more so. He began as a comic writer, but then he started explaining really quite complicated history, complicated science in the most accessible way.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what I want to do. I want to explain things which are very, very difficult.
Yeah. Well, you unpack and you distill a lot of important and heavy work and make it intelligible and readable. So all hats off to you. For the book, though, you had the joy of traveling to several places, including India, Barbados, Mauritius, Nigeria, to gather testimonies and thoughts. Can you talk us through that decision? Why those places? What were you thinking?
Well, I'm not a great traveller, as you probably worked out, right? I don't really like leaving the house. And, as a kid, we never had holidays. So my only holiday was we had one day at Weston-super-Mare. Nice place. I recommend it.
Was it a good day?
It was a good day. And Nigeria is very difficult. I mean, every Nigerian I know, including David Olusoga, told me not to go.
So, let me interrupt you there. Before going to Nigeria, Sathnam completed a proof of life document. What's that?
Oh, yeah. So this is, if you go to a very dangerous place where there's a lot of kidnapping, there's a lot of kidnapping in Nigeria, you have to tell your loved ones, give them a question that only you can answer, so that when the kidnappers ring, they can say, can you ask this proof of life? I'm going to tell you what my proof of life question is. You should all think of one for yourselves. Mine was my coffee order, because it's so pretentious that no one could possibly... I have a decaf oat flat white, right? So that's proof I'm alive.
Right.
But yeah, it's quite a good question to work out for yourself.
But if you have to fill out a proof of life document, does that make you nervous about the country you're going to?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I emailed my nieces and my editor and telling them I was going, and this was my proof of life question. And I still haven't told my mother. My mother thinks I went to France. Still haven't told her. She would probably hit me if she knew. Yeah.
But were you surprised by what you learned there? And was it as dangerous and as fearful a place?
To be honest, it's quite scary. And actually, I've had my girlfriend's brother-in-law got kidnapped recently. Oh. And David Olusoga's family's got in trouble. There's it feels out of control. And but it's fascinating because this country entirely created by British Empire. You know the word Nigeria? It was a Times leader writer who came up with the word randomly. It was like, hey, we should call this part of the world Nigeria, and they called it Nigeria. And the country was entirely created by British colonialists. And these are people who had never been brought together before. And then there's a civil war along that line, and obviously. But the thing I was most surprised by was how the education there the schools that the British set up are still teaching imperial nostalgia of the kind that we've actually got rid of. Our education is quite bad, but it's not as bad as that. So you can then understand why someone like Kemi Badenoch, who was, I think, educated in Lagos, would think that Nigerians love the empire, because that's what they're being taught, right? So you've got this odd situation where a decolonized country is teaching colonizing material, and then that person comes back and then raves about the empire. It's mad, isn't it? You've got this insane situation where the British converted large parts of Africa to Christianity, and now the most vibrant churches in London are Nigerian churches. And they want to convert British people to Christianity. So it's like, what's going on there? It's mad, isn't it? And then there's homosexuality, where the British, where a lot of societies in India and Africa and the Caribbean had quite liberal attitudes towards homosexuality. The British introduced anti-homosexual laws, which are still in place. And now Britain is lobbying these countries to get rid of those laws. And the Africans are accusing the Westerners of trying to make everyone homosexual. Right? It's crazy. It's like, where does it begin and end? It's such a... But I find it fascinating the way it works.
One of the things that intrigued me was your visit to Barbados, where there is money to be made in tourism by showing people the homes of enslavers. What was your experience there of talking to people who worked, for instance, in those houses?
Yeah, I mean, I've done tours of former slave plantations around the world, because I really know how to have a good time. I've done it in the Deep South. I always ask awkward questions at the National Trust homes I go to, and you kind of expect it there. But to go to Barbados and go to 3 plantation homes, and for them to barely mention slavery at each one, I was shocked. But then I talked to one of the workers, who was a young black man, a student, who was even more upset than me, understandably. And the reason he'd taken the job was to talk to people about the history, and he was told not to, because basically the people coming to these houses were coming off cruise ships. They wanted to go straight to the buffet or the rum tour. They didn't want their day ruined by thinking about slavery. They wanted to marvel at the achievements of their white ancestors in building these Jacobean mansions in the middle of the Caribbean, but they didn't want their day wrecked. It's quite depressing that that's still going on in Barbados, of all places.
You say of all places. Can you explain why you should say that? Because Barbados used to be called Little England, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we forget that actually Barbados and the Caribbean in general, how much money it made the British. I mean, it was a much more valuable colony than America. We think of America as being about... It made a fortune for people like James Drax, whose descendant, Richard Drax, was, until last week, a Tory MP, whose wealth... He was the second richest MP in Parliament. His wealth coming largely from what James Drax did, which is he came up with the idea... Well, he nicked the idea that the Dutch were doing, which is using the enslaved to produce sugar on an industrialized basis. And the entire society there was based on this industry. And lots of British people there, and they built another Britain. I think it's called Little Britain, was the nickname?
Little England. Yeah.
Little England, that was it, yeah. Mm-hmm. So you go there and it feels very British, but there's ancient reasons for that.
One of the interesting things you also talk about in your book is this idea of generational trauma or post-traumatic slavery disorder. So I've done a little bit of research in this myself, and I went to Barbados, and I was struck by what would seem to be counterintuitive. A lot of the people I spoke to were educators, were convinced that they shouldn't teach children about slavery because it's such a negative, horrific story that it leaves you feeling really bad about yourself. And what they were doing, they said that they should talk about the entrepreneurship of the enslavers.
That sounds like something Donald Trump wants to do.
Well,
it?
yeah. That's what they were positing, that actually there's so much damage that can be done to people who have been the descendants of slavery that you don't want to continue that damage by laying on the fact that they are to be considered victims, I suppose.
Yeah, and actually I was really struck by this. In Nigeria and Jamaica, I came across so many people who didn't want to talk particularly about the British Empire, and they were like, we need to face up to our terrible politicians. Empire ended a long time ago. There's such a lot of anger towards how politicians have not made the situation better for their people.
So you went to Mauritius. Why Mauritius?
Mauritius, a society entirely largely created by Indian indenture labour. So Mauritius is run by a Hindu majority now, and all the politicians are Hindus, and it's because so many Hindus went there to do this work. And then they did quite well, and they're quite prosperous, but the enslaved community is still there too, and they don't have such great outcomes. It's interesting to see how slavery as a system crushed people, I think, much more than indenture. Sometimes people compare them. I don't think you can compare them.
And has it led to some sort of polarization in the way that people vote then?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And and they've got the Hindu majority politicians there. They've got quite deep connections to the BJP in India. And you see how actually the Hindu nationalist movement is international. You know, you see it in Britain, you know, and it's a form of racism.
Now, you talked earlier about the disadvantages of being a historian who's not white and being the target of bigots. But is there a benefit to be had if you're a person like yourself traveling in former colonies where people look like you? Do you have an advantage? Do you become like a participating observer? Are you let into secrets that you wouldn't get if you weren't the kind of person that you were?
Yeah, you get weird. It's quite weird being in India because obviously people speak to you. They sometimes assume you're Indian, and then you can't speak Hindi very well, and sometimes they think you're pretending. And that's quite peculiar. But the most peculiar thing is when they can tell before you've even opened your mouth that you're British. And you're like, what is it? Is it my haircut? Is it my awkward manner? How can you tell? Do you get this?
Yeah, man. So when I was 19, I'm born here, born in the capital of Britain, in Luton. And when I was 19, I went to Jamaica for the first time. And when I was growing up in Luton, I always admired the way that my father and his friends walked. My father, the walk was just faster than slow. And I thought it was a really cool walk. And so when I was 19, I went to Jamaica for the first time by myself. I was staying in a guest house. And every day I walked to the market. I'd pass the higglers. You know what a higgler is? A street seller. They had what they call a bend-down market. A bend-down market is someone puts a cloth on the floor, all the wares on the cloth, you bend down to pick it up. That's a bend-down market. Every time I passed this higgler, he'd shout out to me, "Hey, Englishman, Englishman, Englishman." So I just would ignore him. And eventually, after about 5 days, I said to him, "What makes you think I'm English?" He says, "You walk like an Englishman." So, whether you're of some other culture, but you're here, you've actually been brought up here to gesture, to speak like a person from this country. So I'm not surprised, really, that you're mistaken for who you really are.
Yeah.
I suppose.
Yeah, no, it happens a lot, and it's confusing. It's confusing for everyone, not least me.
How does the book fit into, it's a rather long question, how does the book fit into the world of literature, which is tackling these difficult subjects of talking honestly about some of the darker, more shameful aspects of British history? Incidentally, we think these are modern critiques, but, for instance, on the 27th of July, 1959, Enoch Powell delivered a speech in the Commons about the Hola camp in Kenya, where 11 Mau Mau were killed after refusing to work in the camp. Powell was appalled and argued, we dare not, in Africa of all places, fall below our highest standards in the acceptance of responsibility. So the debate's been going on for a while, but more recently I'm thinking of books like Corinne Fowler's Our Island Stories and Nick Rankin's Trapped in History. So how does your book, do you think, fit into these ways which we are interrogating some of these more unpalatable truths?
I guess I see it more in relation to Neil Ferguson books and Jeremy Paxton's book. I guess Neil Ferguson's book was massive, and it really had a massive influence on Michael Gove, who then hired Ferguson as an educational advisor. Yeah. And Jan Morris's books, she wrote a trilogy on the British Empire, which had huge influence upon, very specifically, Tories who went to Eton, who then inflicted their imperial nostalgia upon Britain. And the thing is, I can read Neil's and Jan Morris's books and be okay with them. I disagree with them, but they're not factually incorrect. They acknowledge the horror of slavery, they observe the Tasmanian genocide, but what you've got now is imperial nostalgia. I'm not going to name the writer, but you can probably guess who it is, that goes way beyond that cherry-picks evidence, that denies the Tasmanian genocide, which both Jan and Neil didn't do. And it's much more extreme than Neil or Jan Morris or even Enoch Powell ever was. So this is that's what the culture war's done. It's taken us into such dark territory that even these people didn't really go into. And, I think Neil's book is okay. I mean, I agree. The conclusion's mad, but historically there's no factual errors in it. Whereas I could point out many factual errors in modern imperial nostalgia.
You've kind of answered this, but let's have another go. I've written down, are we still...
By the way, I think the clock has frozen. Has it? No, that's the time now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the time now.
I thought it was a countdown. Oh. Ignore me, carry on. I was like, 15 minutes left.
Are we still trapped in history, which is a phrase James Baldwin first coined in The Fire Next Time in this country, or have we wiggled free, do you think?
No, I think we've still got lots of work to do, clearly. I'm feeling a bit more optimistic because I feel like the culture war is quite something. I mean, you expect to be trolled and stuff, but to have government ministers egging these people on was really depressing. To have, Boris Johnson in the middle of a pandemic taking time out to say, I am going to protect the statue of Winston Churchill with my last breath. When people were actually dying of their last breath because he wasn't doing his job properly, and the statue was not under any threat. When Oliver Dowden, the culture secretary, said he was going to chain himself to the statue of Nelson to stop it being torn down. And it's like, go ahead, mate. Feel free.
Nelson's Colin.
Nelson, yeah, he was like, he was going to climb up and chain himself because he wanted to create the idea that the woke wanted to tear it down. No one serious wanted to tear down the statue of Nelson, but they want to create the point about culture wars, if you go into the history of the culture wars, which go back to Germany, is that they never end. You want to create a never-ending sense of grievance, which they've been very successful at, which is what the right-wing press still do. But I do feel hopeful, because Keir Starmer speaking out in defense of the National Trust, Lisa Nandy, the new cultural secretary, saying that there's going to be no more culture wars. I feel positive about that, but equally, I know what the right-wing culture wars will say. They say they are the culture warriors for saying that, because it's in the eye of the beholder, isn't it, who the terrorist or who the culture warrior is. And so I feel they're going to be with us, but at least the government is not going to be endorsing them. So I feel like we're moving on in one respect.
Aren't you encouraged by the people here, though? These
people, I can't see them.
But they are out there, and there are several hundred out there, and they pay good money to come and listen to you. So it's a sense that there is an audience that is receptive to what you're writing.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, the books have done well. And, it's amazing going to schools, and I get so many letters all the time from students saying they now want to study history because of Empireland. And I always say to them, look, often they write because they're applying for university. And I always say, look, if you're going to go to a university interview, don't go in saying you've been inspired by my book. Or if you do, go in and be prepared to tell them what the problems are with my book. Because history is argument, and they want to see evidence of critical thinking. And the nature of history is such that in 10, 20 years, there'll be a book out explaining why I'm totally wrong. But that's as it should be. I hope I don't react in the way that some historians do, where they go mental and they decide that their version is the only version that can only possibly exist.
Yeah. Well, I think you're quite a sanguine fellow. I think you'll be okay. I'm going to ask a few questions that have come from the audience now, and some of them are actually better than my questions, so I'm really pleased to receive them. So here's the first question. What incentive is there...
I thought you were going to who wants a prediction for the football score?
Yeah. hope it doesn't go to penalties. What incentive is there not to repeat unethical and lawless actions of the colonial past if it proves so profitable and made Britain so powerful? Surely the lesson is that if you go to another people's land, invade, plunder, and dominate, then those people are weakened and unable to resist colonization. What is stopping it from being repeated exactly?
It's a brilliant question, and the answer is there's nothing stopping people. This is why we need to have this conversation. And you just need to look at Russia. Russia has basically got a really bad case of imperial nostalgia, so much so that it's invading Ukraine. And what is China doing in Africa? It's buying up influence in a way that is not dissimilar to what the British Empire did. What did arguably the Americans have had an empire, and a lot of presidents have talked about how they were inspired by the British Empire. That famous poem by Rudyard Kipling, White Man's Burden, that was written by Rudyard Kipling, one of my most famous imperialists, to the Americans, telling them to do in the Philippines what we'd done in Asia. And it had a very positive response. So there's nothing stopping people, and this is why we need to talk about the example of British Empire and what could go wrong.
But what incentives can we give those people who are in those discussions?
Who are nostalgic about it, you mean?
Yeah. I mean, what can you give them to offset the fact that they won't have that lovely, warm feeling of their past anymore?
I guess you can make the case for liberal democracy. Give them and just study. What happens to empires? They all end, don't they? And it's interesting that the height of empire, the British imperialists were massively keen on comparing themselves to the Romans. There's a statue of Clive of India dressed up in a Roman toga in the Foreign Office right now. So if you're an Indian diplomat, you've got to go past it before you talk to the British. Wow. And that just shows you how these ideas, this nostalgia continues. But all empires end. But I think there's something natural about wanting to think the best about your empire. The Sikhs had an empire, a pretty small one, but I've not met a single Sikh who doesn't talk about our empire as being multicultural, benign, peaceful, but it wasn't. Like all empires. It was violent, repressive, and we need to kind of look into ourselves and go beyond our natural tendency to want to think the best.
Thank you. Here's a question from don't correct me because you won't be able to correct me because I don't want to hear you correct me. Dr. Carolyn Moyer. Dr. Carolyn Moyer has...
We've got a doctor in the house.
She asked this question. Sorry, Carolyn, I've got your surname incorrectly pronounced. Your excellent books reach only a small segment of the population. Even if the national curriculum was radically
Freudian slip there.
Was radically amended, that still would not impact those who have already left school. Good point. What do you think is the best way of sharing a broader understanding of Britain's colonial and imperial past?
That's such a good question. I think about this all the time, and she's right. I think what Germany do so well when it comes to teaching the history of the Holocaust, it's not just that they're endlessly writing books on it and facing up the history and the politicians talk about it. Their film scene, their art scene, is endlessly going back there. You think about how many honest films have there ever been about the British Empire? It's the biggest thing we ever did. It went on for 300. I could point out dozens of films about the Tudors, hundreds of films about World War I and World War II. In terms of the empire, I could think of Zulu, slightly problematic film. What else is there? There's the Ian Forster.
Oh, yes. Passage to India.
Passage to India.
Right.
But even that is kind of rose-tinted a bit, isn't it? Why is it we don't make films?
What about Gandhi?
Gandhi was that's probably the best, most honest portrayal of empire we've had. But we don't go there. And that is how you change the narrative, is through TV and film. And we just don't go there for some reason. It's really odd, because it's really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Caroline. Were the British excessively harsh, keen to steal?
Stop the question there, yes. They probably were.
And were they mean-spirited compared
All right.
to other colonialists.
Well,
Other empires. Were they worse than other empires that are rape, pillage, and stealing?
This is a very, very common question. And sometimes it's meant sincerely and it's general curiosity. Quite often it's a question that's posed to people like David Olusoga and I as a way to make us shut up. Because they'll say, why are you talking about the British Empire? Why don't you talk about the Belgian Empire? Because it was much worse. And I'll say, well, I'm not writing about the Belgian Empire because I'm not Belgian. I don't know about it. I'm British and I'm interested in it. Also, the British Empire was the biggest empire in human history. But also, how do you compare? How do you compare rape and murder? You can do it in numbers, but that doesn't really give you a sense of the there's no moral equivalence. Even within empire, when people try to balance 3 million Africans enslaved against miles of railway built in India, how many miles of railway make up for a human life? So how do you begin to compare empires which are so complex and so different? The Belgian Empire was unbelievably brutal, but also it was much shorter and much more geographically concentrated. I don't know how you begin to compare that to 350 years of British imperial history. So I would say it's impossible to compare, and we shouldn't compare. We should try to understand both bits of history discreetly. Would you agree?
I would agree. And I remember reading a book called What We Can Learn from the Germans about...
Oh, was that Susan Nyman?
Yeah.
Great book.
The damage that that country did and how they were going to make amends for that. You know, they weren't going to shy away from reparations, for instance. They were going to embrace, they were going to give money to every Jewish person who has a relative who suffered or died in those camps. So there are things to learn from other countries, how they've embraced their terrible pasts.
My only problem with that book was, yes, Germany is amazing when it comes to facing up to its World War II history, but it had an empire.
Yeah.
It's not particularly good at talking about its own empire, although it has paid reparations of a sort, I think €1 billion for a genocide. But, yeah, you know.
You mean in Southern Africa?
Is it Herero?
Yeah. What was this is a very particular question, which I think you'll be able to. What we tried to do was to sort of sift through the questions that might elicit an answer. So
you're making them sound very intelligent. So it's reflecting well on them.
What was the protocol by which plantation owners recruited indentured labourers, particularly from South India, where labourers could not give informed consent?
It varied, but I can't give a precise answer to that. You'd have to go in and look at the exact protocols. But often people just talk about indenture as the new slavery, but it's not, because in general people signed a contract and they saw that contract, and it was generally 5 years long. And also, as a phenomenon, indenture involved fewer people, 1 million people, and it was over within 80 years. And why was it over so quickly? Partly because of abolition. Because those people who had abolished slavery, who had campaigned for almost centuries, didn't give up. They were on it. So they were visiting these plantations, which were the same plantations, to have a look at how Indian indentured labourers were being taught. There were endless reports and commissions. And so that's why eventually, I think by 1918, it was over. So I would say, yes, the protocols were loose, and people were definitely living in the same places as the enslaved. Sometimes they were punished in the same ways. Sometimes they weren't paid. Sometimes they tried to run away. Sometimes they suffered from rape and other sorts of crimes. But it still was not as bad as slavery, where people didn't have a right to family. They weren't allowed to stay with their family or keep their children, and were literally property.
And they couldn't leave because they had no money to leave. And they had to pay for their upkeep and accommodation. So by the time the 5 years was up, there was no means for them to go back to India. Yeah,
I mean, it's really heart-rending. One of the most stories I just can't forget is of some of these Indian labourers who ended up in Guyana, in South America, and their understanding of where they were and what they'd been told was so dubious that they would try to run away from Guyana and try to walk back home. They tried to walk to India, and they would always die, obviously.
That's pitiful.
It's pitiful, isn't it?
Yeah. Here's a slightly lighter question. What role has James Bond played in romanticising this stretch, reach, and power of the British Empire?
My God, you know what? I'm not a massive Bond fanatic, but I know GoldenEye's in Jamaica.
Correct. Yeah.
So you might be a better person to answer this.
Yeah. Ian Fleming had a house in Jamaica where he wrote all the Bond films.
I've been there.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. It's now a luxury holiday resort. Sorry.
Yeah. I went there when Chris Blackwell. Do you know Chris Blackwell?
Yeah, he was the guy who set up Island Records, signed up Bob Marley.
That's right. Yeah. Because he inherited that place from Ian Fleming. And I remember going to interview him for a book I wrote about the Whalers. And he's a typical Jamaican. He's white, but he's a typical Jamaican.
He's got quite a heavy Jamaican accent, yeah.
But I say typical because I flew from London to Jamaica, and I got to the interview on time, and he wasn't there. And I remember his assistant said, "Oh, he's just gone for a swim. Would you like to go for a swim yourself?" And I said, "I don't have any swimming trunks." So, Sathnam, I'm the only person other than Chris Blackwell who's worn Chris Blackwell's swimming trunks.
I thought you were going to say you did it naked, so could have been a worse story.
So I'm really impressed by Sathnam's book. And I just wonder whether you have brought some of the detractors back on side and that they've put down their spears and you don't have to put on your breastplate. Have you had some people who've...
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. And you know what? I work on the Times, and obviously a lot of the readers don't agree with me, but some of them do. And I get letters from people in their 70s and 80s saying, thank you for your book. I now realize what I'd been taught at school was propaganda. I just hope I get to the age of 70 and 80 and I have the ability to change my mind. I think that's the most important thing you can have as an intellectually engaged person.
I think it's so true because you invest so heavily in the narrative that you've been telling yourself, and to divest yourself of that narrative requires quite a big step. It requires some courage as well, doesn't it?
Yeah. And actually, Jan Morris is an incredible example of this. You know, she wrote such an imperial nostalgic series of books. She was asked in a radio interview, I think in the year of her death, how do you feel about those books now? Because she glosses over quite a lot of racism and slavery. And she said, I'm ashamed.
Really?
And I was like, wow, I just hope I have that flexibility. And weirdly, last week I got a letter from her son saying, I heard you on the radio and I had to stop driving because me and my wife both thought you sounded exactly like Jan Morris on the radio. And I think what he meant was the way I talked about it in a kind of nuanced way. Hopefully that's what he meant. Yeah, and I really hope I can change my mind.
You haven't done your own audiobook. Why is that?
Because I hate my own voice. And also, thing is, it's that famous line, a writer never finishes their book. They just have it taken away from them. And if I ever read my book, any page of any book, I just want to rewrite it. I just see the problems. And so the problem is when you're recording an audiobook, you record your own.
I did, yeah.
You sit in a studio for 7 days.
Yeah, crying.
You can't crying. You can't correct anything. It's too late. It's printed.
Yeah.
So it's just an utter exercise in torture. Plus, it's really badly paid. Yeah.
That's true. What's been the response closer to home amongst your family? So when I wrote my first book and I presented it to my mother, there were tears. She said, this is history. She didn't mean this is a history book. She meant this is history in terms of the way that our family has done things. We never had a writer in the house before. What's been the response?
I think my parents would cry if only because I didn't become a doctor instead. It's odd being it's a bit odd, but actually liberating in my family because they're not great readers. So my sister, my younger sister, who was in my memoir, she's literally a character in the book, has never read the book. Wow. The other day, she lives in Canada, she came up to me and was like, oh my God, I've read your book. I was like, wow, you read it? What do you think about our family story? And she went, no, I read your kid's book. My two nieces were set my memoir at school.
Wow.
And asked for special dispensation not to study it.
Really?
Yeah, they didn't want to read it. I understand it was too upsetting. I was happy with it. It was fine. My other niece studied history at Bristol University did a module on colonialism. Her friends had read Empireland, and she refused to read Empireland.
Wow.
Yeah. But she claims to be thinking about it now. But this is the way it should be. And actually, as a writer, it's liberating, because I think a lot of middle-class writers are scared to write about their family, because they're going to read it, and they're going to be upset, whereas my family don't read me, so I can say what I like.
So, listen, you've written an amazing book, a really impressive book, and as you heard, I reviewed it very well, very positively.
I loved your review, but you said backstage that you never ever review a book badly.
Well, no.
So now I feel a bit crushed.
No. If I think a book is bad, I'll just give it back to the publisher.
Oh, okay.
Give it back to the paper, and I won't review it.
Okay.
And I really like to work out what the writer's trying to do when they write the book. That's how I approach.
That's a good philosophy,
criticism.
I think.
Did the writer fulfill what the writer set out to do, in my mind? But I was reading your book, and it's a big book. So I read a big book on this guy called Marcus Garvey, and after I finished the book, my partner, who's here, said, "If you ever write such a big book again, I'm going to leave you." So is your partner more forgiving? If not, how did you get away with it again?
Well, the book partly came about because of her, because I should say she's a smart person. She's got a first-class degree in history from Oxford, but she's got a terrible sense of geography. And I said, we needed to escape empire as a subject, because I was being trolled so much. It was our first holiday after COVID. And I said, why don't you book it? And she booked us a holiday to Barbados. So it's her own stupid fault.
That's where it started.
But yeah, I'm writing, my next book's going to be actually about, it's a musical subject. She knows even less about music, so yeah.
So what's your partner called?
Nor.
We must thank Nor for inspiring this fantastic book, and I'd really like you to put your hands together to applaud and to celebrate and to welcome into your hearts and to think about going and sharing the love when he signs your book. Sathnam Sanghera.
Thank you, Colin. Thanks very much.
Yeah. So Sathnam will be. Thank you very much. Sathnam will be signing the book in the foyer in a few minutes. Thanks again.
Thank you.
And good luck, England.